On the day I buried my wife and son, I looked at the front row of the chapel, 3 empty chairs with name cards that read Norman Collins, Ashley Collins, Sean Collins. My parents and my brother, they never showed up. While I lowered my family into the ground, they were raising champagne glasses in Hawaii, celebrating what they called real family. And when I thought the pain couldn't cut any deeper, just days later they walked into my house, not with comfort, not with an apology, but with papers. They demanded I co-sign $40,000 of debt for my brother's failed dream. That was the moment something inside me broke. You see, I had been invisible all my life, forgotten at graduations, abandoned when sick, overlooked when promises were made. But that day, standing in the wreckage of everything I loved, I swore I would never stay silent again. I rose from the ashes of betrayal, and when I finally exposed them in front of everyone, the truth was so brutal it turned their faces white. This is not just a story about family. It's a story about how far a man can be pushed before he fights back, not with fists, but with dignity, with revenge, and with proof no one could deny. And by the end, you'll see exactly what I said in that crowded room that froze every single voice in silence. So let me ask you, if the people who were supposed to stand beside you betrayed you in the cruelest way possible, would you forgive them? Or would you rise like I did? My name is Daniel Collins, and if you've ever been the forgotten child, the one standing in the shadows while everyone else basks in the light, then you might understand a piece of my story. I was born into a family where loyalty was supposed to mean everything. But from the very beginning, it was clear that loyalty in my house had conditions. My younger brother Sean was the golden son. He could stumble, fail, and make a mess of anything, and my parents, Norman and Ashley, would still rush to protect him, polish his image, and call him their pride. I, on the other hand, was expected to survive on my own. No praise, no safety net, no recognition, just silence. One of my earliest memories still stings like fresh guilt on a wound. I was 15, burning with a fever so high I could barely lift my head from the pillow. I prayed that my mother might sit by my side, that my father might bring me water. Instead, I heard the sound of the car pulling out of the driveway. They had taken Sean to a basketball tournament in another state, leaving me alone in the dark. The fever raged all night, and I whispered for help that never came. When morning arrived, I was still lying there, drenched in sweat, clinging to my pillow like it was the only thing that cared if I lived or died. That night taught me something I would never forget. In my family, I was invisible. The years that followed only confirmed it. At my high school graduation, I stood on the football field in my cap and gown, scanning the bleachers. Other kids waved at their parents, posed for photos, basked in the glow of pride that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. I stood there with my diploma in hand, smiling for the camera of a friend's father, because my own parents weren't there. They had chosen once again to take Sean to another competition. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need anyone's approval. But deep down, I knew that smile I forced was a lie. It wasn't just big moments they stole from me. It was the everyday slights that cut the deepest. When I turned 18, my father promised me the old Chevy pickup from the garage, the one I dreamed of using to start hauling work and finally stand on my own. I spent weeks cleaning it, imagining my independence. But when the day came, my father handed the keys to Sean. No explanation beyond a cold remark: Daniel will be fine on his own. Sean needs this more. The engine's roar as Sean drove away was the sound of my own hopes being stripped away. Words can wound worse than fists, and my mother had a favorite phrase she repeated whenever I asked for help. "You'll be fine alone." She said it when I struggled with homework, when I needed guidance about jobs, when I asked why they never came to my games or ceremonies. Over time, those words branded themselves into me like a scar. Fine alone, always alone. It was their excuse for every abandonment, their shield against their own neglect. And so I grew up learning to carry myself through storms with no umbrella to patch my own wounds, without anyone offering a hand. I became a truck driver, long-haul routes across endless highways, because the road made sense in a way my family never did. The road was harsh, but it was honest. If you worked hard, stayed awake, and kept your eyes steady, you got to your destination. That was more than I could ever say about the house I grew up in. But no matter how many miles I drove, no matter how many states I crossed, the emptiness of those years never left me. And as I would come to learn, the scars of being the forgotten son don't fade with time. They only deepen when betrayal cuts again. Because what began in my childhood, the absence, the favoritism, the cruel words, would follow me into adulthood. And one day it would collide with the worst loss a man could ever face. That collision would not only break me, but also awaken something inside me. I didn't know I had the will to fight back. This is not just a story about grief or neglect. This is about betrayal so sharp it can split open the soul. And if you've ever been pushed past the point of silence, if you've ever dreamed of turning the tables on those who treated you as nothing, then stay with me. Because my story is about to show you how much a man can endure before the fire inside finally burns too hot to be ignored. And the first spark was lit the night I realized my parents never truly saw me. Not then. Not ever. The silence of the funeral hall lingered in my chest, long after everyone had gone home. Those 3 empty chairs weren't just a reminder of one moment, they were the echo of a lifetime. As I sat in my quiet house that night, Jacob's glove resting untouched on the table, memories I had tried to bury clawed their way back into my mind. The betrayal at the funeral wasn't the first. It was the final proof of what I had always known: I had never truly mattered to them. I remembered one night when I was 15, burning with fever so high I could barely stand. My body shook with chills, sweat soaking the sheets. I waited for my mother to come check on me, or for my father to bring a glass of water. Instead, the sound I heard was the car engine roaring to life outside. They were taking Sean to his basketball tournament in Dallas. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, whispering for help into the dark. But no one came. When dawn finally broke, I was still alone, clutching a damp pillow, too weak to move. That was the night I understood what it meant to be invisible in your own home. The pattern never changed. On my high school graduation day, I stood on the football field in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd. All around me, kids waved to their parents, cameras flashing, proud smiles shining down from the bleachers. I searched every row, clinging to the hope that maybe this time they would show. But the seats where I thought they might sit remained empty. Later, I found out they had gone with Sean again, this time to another tournament. I forced a smile for a friend's father who took my picture, but inside, the emptiness hollowed me out. A milestone that should have been a moment of pride was nothing more than another reminder of where I stood in their eyes. When I turned 18, my father promised me the old Chevy pickup that had been sitting in the garage. He said it would be mine, a way to get started in hauling work, a tool to help me stand on my own feet. I spent weeks cleaning it, polishing it, picturing a future where I could finally carve my own path. But when the day came, the keys weren't placed in my hand. Instead, my father tossed them to Sean. "He needs it more," he said flatly. "Daniel will be fine on his own." I watched my brother drive away in the truck that was supposed to be my chance at independence. The sound of the engine roaring like laughter at my expense. It wasn't just the events, it was the words, the phrases that carved scars deeper than any missed milestone. Over and over again, my mother dismissed me with the same refrain. You'll be fine alone. She said it when I needed help with schoolwork. She said it when I begged for advice about jobs. She said it when I wanted nothing more than her attention. Those 4 words became the brand I carried into adulthood, a constant reminder that my needs, my feelings, my very existence were always secondary. Sean was the golden child. He was dressed in new clothes while I wore hand-me-downs. He was cheered at every game while I sat on the bleachers unnoticed. He was praised for achievements, even small ones, while my efforts were brushed aside as if they didn't matter. They raised Sean like a prince and left me to grow up in his shadow. One night, years later, I confronted my mother about it. I asked her why Sean always got the best, why I was always left behind. She looked at me with a weary swoon, as if I were being dramatic. "Daniel," she said, "you've always been strong. You don't need us like Sean does." That was their excuse, my supposed strength. But what they called strength was really neglect. They used it to justify every time they abandoned me, every time they left me standing alone. As I sat in the silence of my house after Emily and Jacob's funeral, those memories played in my head like cruel echoes. For years I had told myself that maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe it was just bad timing. Maybe one day they would see me. But the champagne glasses in Hawaii proved the truth I had been too afraid to accept. I had never been their son the way Sean was. I was just the shadow they tolerated, the afterthought they dismissed. I whispered into the empty room, the words bitter on my tongue. You raised Sean like a prince and me like a shadow. Saying it out loud made my chest ache, but it was the truth. It was a truth I could no longer run from. That night I made myself a quiet promise. If I was to rise again, it wouldn't be because of them. It would be in spite of them. And though I didn't know it yet, the very next chapter of my life would give me a glimpse of what real love and real family looked like. Her name was Emily. Emily entered my life at a time when the weight of loneliness had nearly broken me. I had been driving long haul for years, the highway my only companion, the hum of the engine drowning out the memories of neglect I carried from childhood. One late afternoon, exhausted from miles of gray road, I pulled into a small roadside cafe along Route 66. That's where I saw her. Emily. She wasn't flashy or loud. She was simple, her dark hair braided loosely, her eyes warm with kindness. She poured me a cup of coffee and asked if I wanted cream. Somehow, in that small question, I felt noticed in a way my own parents had never made me feel. That cup turned into a conversation, and that conversation turned into something that gave my life color again. We married a year later. The wedding was modest, held in a church with faded paint and a choir that sang slightly off-key. But it didn't matter. Emily's laughter filled the space more than any music could. She wore a dress she had sewn herself, and when she walked down the aisle, every scar of my past seemed to fade. My parents didn't attend, of course. They said Sean's college preparations were more important. Yet standing there with Emily's hand in mine, I didn't care. I wasn't the forgotten son that day. I was a husband, and soon after I became a father. Our first home was small, perched on the edge of Tulsa. The paint peeled on the shutters, the roof leaked when spring rains came, and the floors creaked under every step. But to us it was perfect. Emily planted daisies in the front yard, her favorite flower, saying they would keep the place smiling. Inside, I found an old recliner at a yard sale. That recliner became my throne. After long trips on the road, I'd sit there while Jacob, our boy, climbed onto my lap and told me stories about his day at school. His laughter filled the house, echoing against the walls that had once known only Sunts. Jacob was the heartbeat of that home. With his messy hair and curious eyes, he carried Emily's warmth, but my stubbornness. By the time he was 10, baseball had become his world. He'd run around the backyard with his little glove shouting, Dad, I'm gonna be in the Little League. You'll be my coach, right? Each time my chest tightened with pride and pain. I promised him that no matter how many miles I drove, I would never miss his games. I would not abandon him the way I had been abandoned. In those moments with Emily humming thoughtfully in the kitchen, Jacob laughing on my lap, and the daisies swaying outside, I thought I had finally beaten the curse of my family. I didn't need fortune approval or the Collins name that had weighed me down. Emily and Jacob were enough. They were my whole world. But deep down, a whisper lingered, one I tried to ignore. Happiness I knew was fragile. My parents' absence had been a shadow on my wedding day. Their neglect still haunted me in quiet moments. I sometimes wondered if fate would one day find a way to remind me just how cruel life could be. I pushed those thoughts aside, clinging to my small kingdom, but the unease never fully left. And then came the morning that shattered everything, the day when a phone call would tear apart the world Emily and I had built, leaving me with nothing but silence and rage. The morning began like any other, so ordinary that I never imagined it would end in tragedy. Emily kissed me goodbye at the door, her hair still damp from her morning shorter. Jacob darted out behind her, waving his baseball glove in the air. "Don't forget Dad!" "Little League soon," he shouted with that big grin that always melted me. I laughed, tousled his hair, and promised him I wouldn't miss it for the world. Then I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and watched as they walked down the driveway together, hand in hand. That image is burned into me forever, the last time I saw them alive. Hours later, I was fueling up at a small station off a Kansas highway when my phone buzzed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Emily was calling to say Jacob caught a fish at the picnic, or that they had picked a perfect spot by the lake. But when I saw the caller ID, Jacob's teacher, something inside me tightened. I answered, and her voice came broken and trembling. "Mr. Collins, there's been an accident at the lake. Emily and Jacob, they're—" The words dissolved into sobs. I froze, unable to breathe, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I don't remember much of the drive back. My body worked on instinct, my foot heavy on the gas, headlights blurring into streaks of white as I tore down the highway. My mind replayed every second of that morning, as if rewinding the memory could change the ending. By the time I staggered into the hospital, my throat was raw from whispering, "No, no, not them. Please, not them." A police officer met me in the corridor. His eyes carried the weight of news he didn't want to deliver. "Mr. Collins," he said quietly, "your wife and son drowned at the lake this afternoon. The rescue team did everything they could, but—" His voice trailed off. My knees gave out, and I had to grip the wall to stay upright. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, "you're wrong. There's been a mistake." But the silence that followed told me otherwise. They led me down a long hallway to the morgue. The air turned cold, sterile, unwelcoming. My heart pounded in my chest as the attendant pulled back the white sheet. Emily lay there, her hair still damp strands clinging to her pale forehead. Beside her was Jacob, so small, so still, his hands folded at his chest. I reached out, desperate to feel warmth. But when my fingers touched Jacob's, they were icy. My chest collapsed, and a sound tore out of me that I didn't even recognize, a cry so raw it felt like it could rip my throat apart. I should have been there, I choked, pressing my forehead against Jacob's small chest. "I should have saved you." My words shattered in the silence, swallowed by the cold walls. I stayed there for what felt like hours, whispering apologies, bargaining with ghosts, begging for just one more moment. But there was no miracle. Emily and Jacob were gone. When they finally pulled me away, I stumbled out into the night air. The world looked the same, cars drove past, people walked down the street, but for me, everything had ended. Back at the house, Jacob's baseball glove sat on the table waiting for a game that would never come. Emily's daisies in the yard swayed in the wind, mocking me with their stubborn persistence. I sank into the recliner, the same one Jacob used to climb into, and for the first time the silence felt unbearable. I thought of calling my parents. Surely, I told myself, even they would come now. Even they would understand the depth of this loss. My hand hovered over the phone, trembling, but something stopped me. A memory surfaced, my father's voice saying, "Sean needs us more. You'll be fine alone." Deep down, I already knew the truth. If I called, I'd only hear the same cold indifference, and yet part of me still hoped. That hope shattered days later when I discovered what they had chosen instead of grieving with me. While I buried Emily and Jacob, while I clung to their memory in that cold morgue, my parents were raising champagne glasses in Hawaii, celebrating with Sean and his family. To them, my wife and son's funeral was nothing but a useless ceremony. And soon, as if that betrayal wasn't enough, they would return to my doorstep, not with condolences, not with support, but with demands for money. And that was the day my grief would begin to harden into something else entirely: rage. The morning of the funeral dawned with a gray sky, as if even the heavens had chosen mourning clothes. I stood outside the church greeting relatives of Emily who had flown in from different states. People who had known her warmth and Jacob's laughter far longer than some of my own kin had ever cared to. The line of black-clad figures stretched along the pathway, faces pale with grief, yet each one carried something my own family could not be bothered to bring respect. Inside the chapel smelled of lilies and candle wax. 2 caskets stood at the front side by side, unbearable in their stillness. I had reserved a row near them, 3 seats marked carefully with name cards: Norman Collins, Ashley Collins, and Sean Collins. My parents, my brother. Their places stood out like a promise. But as the pews filled with Emily's family, with neighbors, co-workers, even strangers who came, because they had once been touched by her kindness, those 3 seats remained untouched, glaringly empty. Every time I looked at them, the absence pierced me like a nail driven deeper into my chest. I tried to focus on the service, on honoring Emily and Jacob, but the whispers started as soon as people noticed. Where are Daniel's parents? How could they miss their own grandchild's funeral? I heard the murmurs, though no one spoke directly to me. Each whisper was a knife. Emily's uncle leaned over to another relative, shaking his head. Even if there were disagreements, this is shameful. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. It wasn't just my grief on display, it was my humiliation. Halfway through the service, my aunt from Emily's side pressed a trembling phone into my hand. "Daniel," she whispered, "you need to see this." My stomach turned cold as I glanced at the screen. There they were, my parents and Sean, standing beneath palm trees in Hawaii. Champagne glasses raised, Sean's arm slung casually around my mother's shoulders. The caption above it read, "Wonderful moment with real family." My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Real family. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had mocked me publicly, as if erasing Emily and Jacob entirely. I returned the phone without a word, my jaw clenched until it ached. Around me, relatives saw the photo too, their eyes widening with disgust. The whispers swelled into open outrage. How could they? On this day of all days, I felt their pity and their anger intertwining, directed not at me, but at the people whose names sat on those blank cards. But shame has a way of clinging to the one left behind. My skin burned as if all their gazes were condemning me. When the pastor invited me to speak, my legs felt like stone, but I forced myself to rise. Standing at the podium, staring at the sea of mourners, I fought back the urge to collapse. My voice cracked, but I let it carry. I didn't need fortune. Emily and Jacob were my whole world, and even strangers showed more respect than my own parents. Silence followed, heavier than the scent of lilies. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads, but no one dared excuse the empty chairs. After the final prayer, I lingered by the caskets as guests filed out. Emily's parents clutched my hands, whispering, "We are your family now." Cousins embraced me. Even neighbors, their voices soft with sorrow, promised support. Yet no words could erase the echo of those 3 empty seats. The most important witnesses of my life had chosen a tropical beach over a sacred farewell. Their absence screamed louder than any eulogy. That evening I returned home exhausted. The silence of the house pressing against me like a weight. I sat in the worn armchair Jacob had loved, staring at his baseball glove on the table. For a moment I almost convinced myself the worst was over, that I had endured the deepest cut possible. But then my phone buzzed. A message from Sean lit the screen. My hands trembled as I opened it. The words were casual, cruel in their indifference. "Mom and Dad said you handled the funeral fine without us. We'll be back soon. There's something we need to talk about, money." I stared at the message until the letters blurred, rage and disbelief mixing in my chest. They hadn't come to mourn. They hadn't come to stand by me. Yet now, only days later, they would return. Not with comfort, but with demands. As the phone slipped from my hand, I realized the funeral humiliation was only the beginning. The true betrayal was about to walk through my door. The house was quieter than ever in the days after the funeral. Emily's mug still sat on the counter. Jacob's baseball glove waited by the door, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to move through the days one at a time, but grief came in waves, unpredictable and merciless. I thought the worst was over. I thought nothing could cut me deeper than seeing my parents raise champagne glasses while I buried my wife and son. I was wrong. Late one afternoon, the doorbell rang. My stomach clenched. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Norman and Ashley standing there, Sean at their side. For a split second, my chest tightened with hope. Maybe they had finally come to acknowledge what they had done, to say the words I had waited to hear. "We're sorry. We should have been there." But when they walked past me into the living room without a word about Emily or Jacob, I knew better. They settled themselves on the couch as if they were visiting for Sunday dinner instead of stepping into a house still reeking of grief. Norman pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the coffee table. Sean leaned back, smug, like this was all routine. My mother smoothed her skirt, her expression businesslike. Norman cleared his throat and said flatly, "We need your help, Daniel. Sean has a chance to start a new restaurant venture. The bank requires a co-signer. 40,000 should do it. You'll sign here." The words slammed into me like a freight train. I blinked, thinking I'd misheard. They hadn't said Emily's name. They hadn't asked about Jacob. They had walked into the same room where my son's laughter once echoed and opened with a request for money. Ashley's voice slid in sharp and cold. "You have no wife and child now. You should focus on real family, us." I stared at her, my hands trembling. Was this real? Was this how low they had sunk? Sean leaned forward, smirking, and said, "It's just $40,000, brother. With your trucking, you'll manage. Think of it as investing in me. We're all we've got now." His tone was dripping with entitlement, as though my role was to bankroll his dreams. My vision blurred with rage. In my mind, I saw Emily's smile as she stirred a pot of soup, Jacob's eager face holding his glove. They were my family. Not these people who stood in front of me with their hands out, not these strangers who had abandoned me at the darkest hour of my life. I picked up the folder. The numbers on the paper swam before my eyes. The demand wasn't just for money, it was a declaration that my grief meant nothing, that my losses were nothing but an opening for their greed. With a sudden crack, I slammed the folder back onto the table. The sound echoed through the house. "You didn't show up to mourn," I spat, my voice shaking with fury. "But you showed up to rob me." For the first time, their composure faltered. Ashley's lips tightened. Norman's jaw clenched. Sean's smirk twitched at the edges. Norman rose to his feet, his voice a harsh bark. "Watch your tone, Daniel. We are your family. You owe us respect." Sean laughed, bitter and mocking. "Respect? You're a truck driver who'll die alone. You should be grateful we even give you the chance to matter." That was it. The last thread snapped. I stood, my body trembling with years of pent-up humiliation and anger. "Get out," I said, pointing to the door. My voice was low, deadly steady. "If you ever come here again to treat me like a bank, like a servant, you'll regret it." The silence stretched. For once, none of them knew what to say. Sean's face twisted. Ashley's eyes darted to the floor. Norman's fists curled tight, but they turned and left their footsteps heavy, slamming the door behind them. I stood alone in the living room, my chest heaving. The papers still lay scattered on the coffee table, but I didn't touch them. I thought of Emily. I thought of Jacob. I thought of how my parents had chosen champagne over graves and now dared to choose greed over compassion. Something inside me hardened that day. I wasn't just grieving anymore, I was preparing for war. Because deep down I knew this wasn't the end. They would be back. They would always come back, and the next time I needed to be ready. The night after I slammed the door on my parents and Sean, the house seemed to press in on me with its silence. Emily's favorite mug still sat on the counter. Jacob's glove rested by the door, and every creak of the old floorboards felt like echoes of what I had lost. For a long time I thought I had no one left until the phone rang. The number flashing on the screen was international. For a moment I almost ignored it. But something told me to answer. "Daniel," a deep, steady voice said. "It's Ernest, your uncle, from Canada." I froze. Uncle Ernest had left the States decades ago after a falling out with my father. I hadn't heard from him since I was a teenager. Hearing his voice now felt like a lifeline tossed across years of silence. "I saw what happened," he said. "I heard about your parents skipping the funeral. About what they said to you. Daniel, you're not alone." At first, I couldn't even speak. My throat tightened, my eyes burning with tears I hadn't expected. "Why would you call now after all this time?" I finally whispered. "Because I know what it feels like," he said. His voice carried the weight of old wounds. "Norman did the same to me. He wanted to control my life, make me live in his shadow. I left because I refused. He never forgave me. And now I see he's doing to you what he once tried to do to me." I sank into the armchair, the one where Jacob used to curl up beside me, and listened as Ernest laid out a truth I had long suspected but never fully grasped. Norman's cruelty was not just mine to bear. It was a pattern. Ernest described how as young men Norman belittled him, mocked his choices, and made him feel worthless for daring to live differently. Your father only knows how to build one person up, himself or the son he favors. The rest of us, we're expendable. Those words hit me harder than I expected. For years I thought I was cursed, singled out. Now I realized I was part of a long history of Norman's tyranny. Then Ernest's tone shifted, firm and encouraging. "Daniel, I've followed your work from afar. You've been a long-haul truck driver for years. You know the roads, the clients, the logistics. Why keep bending under Norman's shadow? Build something of your own. A small transport company. You've got what it takes. I laughed bitterly. I'm just a broken man with a truck and a graveyard behind me. Wrong, Ernest snapped sharper now. You're a man who survived what most couldn't. That makes you stronger than Norman, stronger than Sean. Family isn't who abandons you, Daniel. Family is who shows up. And I'm here. His words struck deep. I thought of Emily's smile, Jacob's laughter, and the life they believed I could give them. For the first time since the accident, I felt something stir inside me. Hope, Ernest went on. I know people in Tulsa who need reliable drivers. A man named Carl runs a produce business. Another, Helen, runs a small logistics office in Oklahoma City. I'll connect you. All you need to do is prove what I already know, that you're dependable. I sat there in silence, letting his words settle. My parents had left me with nothing but betrayal. Ernest, a man I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, was offering me a future. Finally, I whispered, I don't know if I can. You can, he said firmly, because you're not alone anymore. From here on, I've got your back. For a moment, the silence in my house no longer felt crushing. It felt steady, filled with a thread of connection stretching all the way from Canada to Tulsa. Mini-climax. I felt a spark I thought had died with Emily and Jacob. For the first time, I wasn't drowning, I was reaching for the shore. As the call ended, I looked around the house at the reminders of what I had lost. Then I looked at the crumpled bank papers my parents had left behind, shoved them into a drawer and closed it hard. A new resolve formed inside me. If Norman and Sean thought I'd stay broken, they were wrong. I whispered into the quiet as if to Emily and Jacob, I'll fight. For you, for me. And yet as I lay awake that night, one thought gnawed at me. If Sean had already stooped so low as to sabotage me with lies, what would he do once he learned I was building something of my own? That was when I realized the real war had only just begun. Ernest's words lingered with me for days, pushing me to take the leap I had always been too afraid to make. A week later, I found myself loading a battered old truck with sacks of potatoes for a farm in western Oklahoma. It was nothing glamorous, but it was my first contract, my first chance to prove. I wasn't just a grieving widower or the forgotten son of Norman and Ashley. I taped Jacob's baseball glove to the passenger seat as a reminder I was doing this for him, for Emily, and for myself. The morning air was cool, the highway stretching out before me like a lifeline. For the first 50 miles, I let myself believe maybe this was the start of something good. But halfway to Tulsa, I heard the sharp pop of a tire exploding. The wheel jerked violently and the truck swerved across the shoulder. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fought to keep it steady. Dust billowed around me when I finally brought it to a stop. For a long moment I sat there, forehead pressed against the steering wheel, whispering, of course. The first job and I'm already failing. But Ernest's words echoed in my mind. Family isn't who abandons you. Family is who shows up. Gritting my teeth, I climbed out, wrestled the spare tire from the back, and forced my body through the grueling repair. Sweat stung my eyes, grease coated my hands, but after nearly 2 hours, the truck was rolling again. By the time I reached Tulsa, I was late, and Carl, the produce distributor Ernest had connected me to, was waiting, arms folded, eyes sharp. You're late, he said flatly, walking around the truck. I braced for him to cancel the deal, but instead he checked the load. Not one sack of potatoes was missing. Not one was torn. After a long silence, Carl looked at me and gave a small nod. At least you didn't quit halfway. Most guys would have called it off. You kept your word. Those words felt like gold. I drove home that night exhausted, but with a flicker of pride burning in my chest. Maybe I could do this. But hope in my family was never safe. 2 days later, I walked into a diner to meet a new potential client, a logistics manager Ernest had referred me to. The man barely let me sit before shaking his head. "I can't work with you," he said. "Your brother told me you had a breakdown after your family died, said you're unstable, unreliable. I can't take that risk." The words hit harder than any flat tire. My fists clenched on the table, but the man was already walking away. Sean had poisoned my reputation, twisting my grief into a weapon. Rage boiled inside me, even now after everything my brother was trying to drag me down. That night I called Ernest, my voice raw with anger. "He's out there spreading lies. How am I supposed to fight this?" "Not with words," Ernest replied, "with proof. Deliver on your promises. Show people the truth with action, not arguments. The right ones will see it." So I did. I doubled down, checking every bolt, every strap, every route, twice before every job. Weeks later, Carl called me again for another delivery. This time, I left before dawn, making sure nothing could go wrong. When I arrived exactly on time, Carl's crew unloaded the truck and he studied me quietly. Finally, he said, "I don't care what your brother says. You delivered. That's enough for me." Mini-climax. In that moment, my chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in years: respect. Earned, not given. I drove home that night, Jacob's glove still riding in the passenger seat, and whispered into the silence, "We're just getting started, buddy." But as much as I cherished that small victory, I knew Sean wouldn't stop. Every step forward for me was a reminder to him that his golden boy image was crumbling. And the more I succeeded, the harder he would try to destroy me. The road ahead wasn't just business, it was war. The weeks following Daniel's first deliveries were grueling, but each mile brought a small measure of redemption. What had started as a fragile experiment with a single truck and a single client slowly grew into something larger. Word spread among farmers who needed someone dependable, and soon Daniel was hauling not only produce but also medical supplies, construction materials, and school equipment. His name carried weight in ways it never had before. People no longer whispered pity when they saw him. They said his name with respect. With the money he earned, Daniel bought a second truck, then a third. Signing the paperwork shook his hands at first, but with each new vehicle his confidence grew. The sight of his trucks lined up in the driveway made his chest swell with pride. For the first time in his life, the Collins name was tied to something solid and respectable, something that belonged to him, not Sean. Soon he could no longer handle all the work alone. He hired his first driver, Mike, a young veteran looking for steady pay, and then a second, a woman named Teresa who had driven buses for years. They wore jackets with Collins Transport stitched above the chest, and each time Daniel saw them climb into the cabs, he felt as though he was finally building not just a company, but a family, one that chose him, not one that abandoned him. Locals began to call him Reliable Daniel. The nickname spread like wildfire. Farmers told each other that if Daniel promised to deliver, the job would be done no matter the weather, no matter the roadblocks. Even people who had once believed Sean's lies about his instability started to see the truth with their own eyes. Daniel was dependable. He was strong. He was not the shadow of anyone else. The proudest moment of those early months came when the school board invited him to a meeting. They needed local sponsors for the Little League team. Jacob had always dreamed of playing there, and though Daniel's heart still ached at the thought, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. He signed the check not as a grieving father, but as the man who could make his son's dream live on. Weeks later, as children in crisp uniforms ran across the field, Daniel stood quietly by the fence. The banner flapped in the breeze, Collins Transport, proud sponsor. His eyes stung, but he let the tears fall. For once, the Collins name meant him. Not Sean, not Norman, him. He whispered under his breath, "For once Collins means me, not Sean." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades. That night when he returned to his modest office, a new contract sat on his desk. It bore his company's name at the top in bold letters, Collins Transport. Seeing it printed there gave him a rush unlike anything he had ever felt. He was no longer just surviving. He was thriving. But even in triumph, shadows lingered. Mike mentioned overhearing rumors again, Sean telling people that Daniel's success was a fluke, that the company was unstable and would collapse within months. Daniel clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. He had learned that revenge didn't always come in loud confrontations. Sometimes it came quietly through persistence, through proving the liars wrong one delivery at a time. Still deep down, he knew Sean and his parents would not stay silent. The more successful he became, the more desperate they would grow. And as Daniel locked his office that night, he felt it in his bones. Their return was inevitable. They would come again, not with champagne glasses, but with demands and accusations. And when they did, he would be ready. The weeks that followed felt like a turning tide. Collins Transport was no longer just an idea scribbled on the back of a notebook. It was alive, humming with engines on the highways, trusted by farmers, businesses, and schools alike. For the first time in my life, people looked at me not as Norman and Ashley's overlooked son, not as Sean's older brother, but as Daniel Collins, a man who had built something with his own two hands. Success tasted bittersweet. I often found myself wishing Emily and Jacob were there to see it, to cheer at the trucks rolling out, to laugh at the sight of my name painted proudly on each rig. But in their absence, I carried their memory as both burden and fuel. It was on one of those quiet evenings in my office, invoices stacked neatly in a folder, that the past came knocking again. A sharp knock on the door, too familiar in its arrogance, pulled me from my paperwork. When I opened it, there stood my parents, Norman and Ashley, and beside them my brother Sean. Their faces told a story long before their mouths did. Norman's once proud posture had sagged under the weight of humiliation. Ashley's carefully painted smile was strained, desperate. Sean, though, still wore that smirk of entitlement, though it twitched at the corners like a mask ready to crack. Daniel Norman said, his voice still trying to carry authority, though it sounded like gravel dragged across stone. "We need to talk." They walked into my office as though they still owned the place, as though decades of absence and betrayal could be erased with one uninvited visit. I sat across from them, my jaw tight, my hands clenched on the desk. Ashley leaned forward, voice clipped but laced with false sweetness. "Sean's business has had setbacks. Unfair circumstances, really. The bank is closing in, and unless we step in, he'll lose everything. Daniel, you need to sell this company and help your brother get back on his feet." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Sell my company? The one I built while you toasted champagne on a beach instead of standing at my wife and son's funeral." My voice cracked with fury, but I didn't back down. Norman's face flushed red, his jaw clenched. "You've had your moment, Daniel. You've proven you can run a few trucks. But Sean, he is the future of this family. Without your help, he'll drown. And you don't want that guilt on your shoulders, do you?" The word guilt hit me like a slap. Guilt. They wanted to talk to me about guilt. After leaving me alone in the cold shadow of two coffins, I rose from my chair slowly, every muscle in my body trembling with years of suppressed rage. "You want to talk about guilt? I buried Emily and Jacob alone. Alone because you chose champagne over family. You didn't stand by me then, and now you want me to save Sean from the mess he created himself." Sean sneered, leaning back with his arms crossed. "Don't be dramatic, brother. You've always been the loner, the worker. I'm the one who carries the Collins name with pride. Help me now, and we can restore what our family once had." I locked eyes with him, my voice cold as steel. "Restore what? A family that never claimed me. A family that treated me like a shadow while you played the prince. Ashley's voice broke her desperation slipping through. "Daniel, please. He's your brother." I turned to my father, the man who had promised me once that I would inherit the old Chevy truck only to hand it to Sean instead. My words came slow, deliberate, each one like a hammer striking iron. "You chose Sean as your son years ago. Live with that choice." Norman's face drained of color. His jaw trembled as though he had been struck. Then his voice erupted, thunderous but cracked. "You're no son of mine." The words meant to wound landed with surprising emptiness. For years I had feared hearing them, but now I realized I had been living them all along. This was just the confirmation. I pointed toward the door, my voice steady. "Get out, all of you. My company, my life, my dignity, none of it belongs to you anymore." For a long moment, no one moved. Norman's fists shook. Ashley's eyes welled with tears. Sean muttered curses under his breath. But slowly, one by one, they turned and walked out, their footsteps heavy with the sound of defeat. When the door closed, I stood in silence. My chest heaved, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear or grief. It was release. I had severed the last tie that chained me to their cruelty. Yet even as I sat back in my chair, I knew this wasn't the end. A family like mine didn't go down quietly. Their pride was too sharp, their sense of entitlement too deep. The storm wasn't over. It was just gathering, and I was finally ready to face it. The Collins family reunion had always been an event where distant cousins, uncles, and aunts gathered to eat, laugh, and reminisce. For years I had dreaded it, knowing I would stand in Sean's shadow while my parents paraded him as their golden son, but this year was different. After everything they had done, skipping Emily and Jacob's funeral, demanding money, trying to strip me of the company I built, I decided I would no longer remain silent. If they wanted to tell lies, I would bring the truth. And this time I wouldn't come alone. When I walked into the community hall, the smell of roasted ham and sweet pies filled the air. Relatives bustled about, exchanging hugs, their voices rising in warm chatter. At the far side of the room, my parents stood tall, Sean beside them, his smirk firmly in place. Norman gave me a stiff nod. Ashley's eyes narrowed and Sean muttered something to a cousin that drew a chuckle at my expense. I ignored it. I carried a folder under my arm, heavy with the evidence of their betrayal. The evening began as it always did, with Aunt Martha welcoming everyone and inviting updates. People shared stories about new jobs, children's graduations, and anniversaries. Then Norman stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall, still trying to command authority. "Daniel has started a small trucking business," he announced. "But he's forgotten his roots. He turned his back on his own family when we needed him most." Ashley added, her tone rehearsed and dripping with false sorrow. "We gave him everything, and now he refuses to help his brother. A son who abandons his family is no son at all." Whispers filled the room. Relatives glanced at me, some with doubt, others with judgment. For a moment, the weight of their eyes felt familiar. The same shame I had carried since boyhood. But this time I didn't shrink from it. I rose slowly, stepping into the center of the room. My voice was calm but cut through the murmurs like a blade. "I've heard the whispers that I am ungrateful, that I turned my back on family. But tonight the truth will speak for itself." I opened the folder and pulled out the first documents, contracts, invoices, and letters from clients praising Collins Transport. "I built this company from nothing," I said firmly. "Every mile driven, every load delivered, I earned it. No one handed it to me." The papers circulated, cousins and uncles nodding as they read. Then I pulled out a photograph, the one I had dreaded and cherished at the same time. It showed my parents and Sean in Hawaii, champagne glasses raised high, the caption beneath it reading, "Wonderful moment with real family." I held it up for all to see. This was posted the very day I buried Emily and Jacob. While I stood over their graves, my parents called it a useless ceremony. The room fell silent. Gasps broke the air. Someone muttered, "My God." The whispers turned to stares, eyes no longer questioning me, but condemning Norman and Ashley. Before they could react, the doors opened. Uncle Ernest entered, his presence commanding instant respect. His voice rang out, "I was at that funeral." I saw Daniel alone, grieving, while the seats marked for Norman, Ashley, and Sean stayed empty. He held up copies of airline tickets, receipts, and Sean's unpaid debts. They weren't absent by accident. They chose champagne and lies over loyalty and blood. The evidence spread like wildfire through the hall. Relatives murmured in shock, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glaring openly at my parents. Norman's face drained of color. Ashley stammered, "It wasn't like that," but her voice cracked. Sean's mask of smugness slipped into rage, his fists clenched at his sides. I stepped forward, my words sharp, final. "You didn't lose me. You never had me." The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents, pale and cornered, stood exposed before the family they had always tried to manipulate. For the first time, the power shifted. They had no defense, no mask strong enough to hide behind. The truth was out, and the room itself had turned against them. As I met their eyes trembling, I felt no fear, only resolve. This wasn't just my revenge. It was justice long overdue. And yet, deep inside, I knew one thing: even cornered snakes still bite. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the final reckoning. The silence that followed the family reunion lingered with me for weeks. I no longer saw my parents as looming figures of authority. They had been stripped bare, exposed in front of everyone. For the first time in my life, their judgment meant nothing. They had already declared long ago that Sean was their son, their pride, their chosen one. All I did was let the world see the truth I had carried for years. And with that, the chains that bound me finally broke. I stopped calling them Mom and Dad in my heart. To me, Norman and Ashley were just two people who had abandoned their own son at the graveside of his wife and child. There was no room for them in my future. But not all family ties were severed. Ernest called the next morning, his voice steady and proud. He told me that for the first time in years he felt like justice had been served. He reminded me that blood isn't family, loyalty is. And in him I finally felt what it meant to have a relative who truly cared. Emily's parents, Ralph and Lillian, welcomed me into their home as if I were their son. We shared meals, laughter mingled with grief, and stories of Emily and Jacob that kept their memory alive. Around their table, I felt something I had never known in my childhood: belonging. I realized that though I had lost my wife and son, I had not lost the chance to live surrounded by love. One crisp autumn morning, I drove to the cemetery with lilies in one hand and Jacob's small baseball glove in the other. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, the sky painted in shades of gray and gold. I knelt before their graves, placing the flowers at Emily's headstone and the glove gently beside Jacob's. My voice cracked, but I spoke anyway. "The company is growing, Jacob. We've got more trucks on the road now, and people call me Reliable Daniel. And Emily, I still hear your laugh in the quiet moments. I hope I've made you both proud." The wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time it didn't sound like emptiness. It sounded like an answer, like they were with me still. A strange peace washed over me. I had carried rage and grief for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply breathe without pain. Standing there, I felt the weight lift, not because the loss was gone, but because I had finally honored it. Back at the office, I paused before the sign above the door, Collins Transport. For years, that name had been a source of humiliation, a reminder that I was never enough compared to Sean. but now it was mine. It represented every mile I had driven, every promise I had kept, every truth I had revealed. The Collins name no longer belonged to them, it belonged to me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of the trucks outside fill the silence. Revenge had been sweet, but what followed was sweeter still. Dignity restored, respect earned, freedom gained. I whispered into the quiet, not for anyone else, but for Emily, for Jacob, and for myself. I live for Emily and Jacob. And I live for myself. That was the truth I carried forward. I had spent a lifetime waiting for validation from people who never intended to give it. Now I no longer needed it. My life was my own, my dignity unshakable, and my future clear. The road ahead was long, but it was mine to walk without shame, without fear, and without looking back. So that's my story. A story of betrayal, grief, and the long road to reclaiming my dignity. I was the forgotten son the man cast aside. But I stood up, fought back, and built something no one could take away from me. If you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever been told you don't matter, then my story is also yours. Because sometimes revenge isn't about shouting the loudest, it's about proving mile after mile that you were always stronger than they believed. Now tell me, what would you have done if your own parents raised a glass of champagne while you buried your wife and child? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have risen like I did and taken back your honor?